The proposed National Defense Authorization Act calls for a major increase in defense spending for FY19 to $716 billion, and it includes a 2.6% increase in pay for the military. Experts say Congress is close to coming up with the final version of the bill and passing it. And a new report by the Heritage Foundation takes a look at the future of the military and how the U.S. should be preparing for future conflicts. I'm joined now by the author of that report, Dakota Wood. He's a senior research fellow for defense programs at the Heritage Foundation. Dakota, thanks for coming in.
Real pleasure.
There's several main takeaways I want to get to the report, but first I want to talk about something that you start at the very beginning of this report. America's military, engaged beyond capacity and in need of rebuilding, is at a critical juncture. Can you expand on what you mean by that?
Well, when you think about the Cold War, which ended in the early 90s with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was a global contest. So we had forces in lots of different places in the world pushing against a major global competitor. Today's military is about 2/3 the size it was back then. Planet hasn't gotten any smaller, and yet we're still engaged in many regions. So you have a smaller military that's been engaged in sustained operations since 2001. After the attacks of 9/11. So, 17 years or so of continuous operational footing, reduced budgets relative to the demand for forces in a very busy, complex world. So it's a military that's getting worn out, equipment's aging rapidly, and it really needs a reset.
So that ties into sort of the first main takeaway that we highlight in this report, which is in preparing for future conflict, we must assume that the future is nonlinear and that force capacity is critical to nearly every preparation activity.
So you have to replace an airplane that wears out or a ship that's reached at the end of life. So at some point you have to buy new stuff. And so what the military tries to do is forecast what the future might call for. What might conflict be like? But in order to make those decisions, you actually have to do a lot of experimentation, testing new equipment, seeing what new technologies, the promise that they have. And what we normally do in the defense community is you make this forecast, see where a trend might go in the future, and you kind of bet everything that you've gotten right. And then it takes 10 or 15 years to develop the new system. You're going to have that for 20 or 30 years. And so what we're proposing is to understand that you can't really predict the future. Trends, yes, but people react to trends. New technologies that you hadn't thought of do come along, and you want to be in a posture that accounts for those things. And so this non-linearity and how you go about doing that, and then having the ability in your budget and with sufficient people to really look at your experimentation efforts. Right now, the military doesn't have that.
And that's something that you drilled down on in this report, is that concept of experimentation. How would you rate the success or how the military is currently utilizing that concept and experimenting?
Poor. On a scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 2. And again, it's because just lack of capacity. So if you've got 2/3 the force and almost the entirety of the force is busy all the time, what we do see in experimentation efforts are very small portions of that military. Sometimes the services will do a very large exercise about every 2 years, but they have too many variables. They're trying to do too many things in a fairly short period of time, even though they put a lot of intellectual effort into getting this one thing right. And experimentation doesn't work that way. In research and development in the commercial community, it doesn't work that way. You have to do these things in little chunks, try to solve problems, see what the utility of a new technology or capability is in a real-world environment. And that's really where the military is coming up short.
Now, the second takeaway that we put in this report is military preference for generational leaps in capability incurs equally significant risk to ensuring that the force remains operationally relevant between leaps.
So there's an incentive to get more efficiencies on a taxpayer dollar. So if I've got 10 different airplanes, 10 different types of mechanics, 10 training pipelines, it's just very complex and it's inherently expensive. If I have one airplane, they'll get a lot of efficiencies out of that, right? So I buy one aircraft, let's say it's the F-35, and the cost per unit starts to smooth out as the industry gets better and better and more efficient at doing that. But what you're saying is you have gotten air power, in the case of the airplane, so right that the one platform is going to meet all your needs for the 20 or 30 years that we'll have it in inventory, right? So these bets on single solutions that are made by a single company that take a decade or more to field and than you have for 3 decades. So those are really big risks that you're running. If there's an operational shortfall or a performance characteristic that the enemy can exploit, your whole capability set has been compromised.
Now, based off of what you've seen from the Trump administration so far, whether it's the people put in place at the top, systems put in place,
Sure.
How optimistic are you that some of these ideas you highlighted in the report will come to fruition?
Well, the rhetoric is there. So during the election season 2 years ago, everybody was talking about the need to rebuild the military. They've been worn out by operational matters. President Trump ended up winning, obviously, and his rhetoric, his statements have been along those lines. Secretary of Defense Mattis has been talking about how stunned he was at the reduction in readiness and the capacity for doing sorts of things. So I think there is a realization that something needs to be done to correct this. The problem is the money doesn't come along with it, right? So the administration has to decide that a percentage of the budget needs to be dedicated to these sorts of things so that the military has the capacity, the people, the experimentation efforts underway to do that, and then Congress has to allocate those funds. So where we're not seeing is, even with the plus-up that you mentioned on the budget, it's still historically low by historical standards. If you went back 30 or 40 years, you're looking at an average of about 5% of GDP. At 5% on an $18 trillion economy, you'd have a baseline budget of $900 billion, not $700. So it's the shortfall in the funding and the wherewithal to do things with people and platforms that is really the obstacle at the moment.
And just 30 seconds left, Dakota. I just want to quickly touch on this last one, which focuses on culture and education and development in the workforce. Next steps there.
Yeah, there's a thought that the military needs to more align itself with civilian society, but civilian society doesn't have to do the same thing that you're calling upon the military to do in a very brutal and realistic combat environment. So this tendency to want to shape the military to reflect civilian culture, I think, is a mistake, and that our culture, our society needs to understand the unique demands placed on the military and then allow the military to use historical experiences to train its people and to have the kinds of structures they need to be successful in combat.
Dakota Wood, thank you so much for coming in.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Now that an official headquarters site has been selected, Army Futures Command has a long road ahead. Up next on Government Matters, top priorities and potential